Well, thanks everyone for joining us. So, as you can see, we're going to look at an independent Scotland in the European Union. And what I've tried to do, first of all, is to base this presentation on the position as we find at the moment. I think to use any kind of different assumptions of what might happen in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years just puts this in a little bit of a position of being really speculative about what we're talking about. So I've said this is the situation now, and how do we move forward from this? So I think the first thing to say is that when we're talking about Scotland, let's say we're independent in 2030, we're really going to be talking about being in Europe by 2040, or maybe even 2045 by the time we would use the euro. So I think it's really important that we're talking about these decisions, which are at least 15 years from where we are now. And as we all know, the economy can change drastically and dramatically in a matter of weeks or months. So I think looking 15 years ahead and saying that's where we want to be just initially seems like a bit of a peculiar position for us to start from. But as I said, I'm going to base this on assumptions rather than speculation. Okay, so let's get going. Well, the first thing I want to look at briefly is the euro. And then I'm going to look at the process of applying to be part of the EU, and I'm going to touch on actual membership. And it might seem like it's the wrong way to do it, euro first and then EU, but hopefully it'll make sense once I go through the presentation. So concentrating mainly on the journey towards us as a member of the European Union. Let's drop some comments in, what you think of my timeline. So 2025, this is kind of best case scenario, a yes vote 2030. 5 years to work everything through. That's based pretty solidly on the position of Brexit. 2035, we're independence. We use sterling for a couple of years. By 2027, we're using our own currency. By 2040, we're applying for EU membership. And then let's say it's super fast, rapid. We're an EU member by 2042. So as I said, that's 17 years from where we are now. And it's quite peculiar that we're focusing on that end destination, considering the huge amount of changes that could happen. But I think that's a realistic timeline. And as I said, please drop in any comments if you think I'm crazy here. We have to have some realistic time frame to be able to talk about the things we're going to cover. So I think the best place to start from is a really quick summary of what's the economic argument for leaving the UK. If we're going to join another currency bloc or another trading bloc, another group of nations, we need to really take a step back and say, well, what is it that we don't like about the UK? And I've come up with kind of 6 key themes. Again, please drop in any where you think are more important than this. And I'm just going to briefly take you through the 6 of them. So the first one, this is certainly my top one. It's maybe not the top of everyone's list, but it is for me. And that's to have our own currency. And this, having your own currency, brings with it all the things that happen to come along when you're a currency issuer. So borrowing in your own currency, being able to devalue your currency if you need to or feel that you want to do that. This is how you provision your government, by releasing your own currency. So that's the first thing, I think, certainly the most important thing for me. The second thing is Scotland as part of the UK. There's no growth model for Scotland. The setup of the UK is for London to do well and for somehow that wealth to trickle across the country. And that was the design right from the late 1970s. And as we all know, that isn't working, hasn't worked. And I think it's a principal reason that most people come up with an argument for independence. The third thing is that we've got no ability to control interest rates, which is your monetary policy as part of the United Kingdom. And we all know that if property prices are sky high in London, the Bank of England keeps interest rates low, and that might cause a negative impact on the rest of the parts of the country, for example, increase unemployment. If Scotland's independent, it can make those changes with its interest rate. The next one would be that we're in what I've called, and I'm sure some of you have seen before, our austerity paradigm, which I'm going to cover, I think, at some point. Here it is here. There's a lot of detail here. You don't need to go into that now. But this is the economic paradigm that we face as part of the European, as part of the UK It's clearly neoliberal. It's very market-based. One of the reasons to have independence is to move out of this austerity paradigm. I've got that as the fourth on the list there. At 5, we don't currently control very important areas of our economy, like energy and financial services, tax rates, corporate governance, immigration. As an independent country, would be able to do that. And then the 6th one is that we're able to fix the levels of taxation and spending to whoever we want and start taxing and spending on the things that we want. So a lot less fiscal constraint. So that's the 6 reasons that I think, the 6 main economic reasons for why we want to leave the European Union, leave the UK. And I'm going to come back to those when we start looking at membership of the European Union or moving towards that. So I said, any of those 6 questions, if anyone has got any comments to make on them or any suggestions, drop them into the chat now and I'll come back to them. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's look at the argument to use the euro. And so the first thing to say on this is that in 2022, the Scottish Government announced that the plan for the currency union with England, which was sterlingisation, was no longer the preferred option for Scotland. So that was made in a paper in 1922. It drew a line under the Growth Commission and the White Paper. The medium to long-term plan is to adopt our own currency. And the quote from the paper is that this would take place as soon as practicable through a careful and managed transition. So for me, that's almost a reason in itself to say to people, let's stop talking about the euro. We've said now that the plan is sterlingisation for a short period and then our own currency. The same paper, A Stronger Europe for Scotland, there's no mention of joining the euro area at all. It's only about joining the EU. So it's really clear that when we're having these conversations about the euro, there's nothing within the current Scottish Government administration, the prospectus, to look towards the euro. And we all know that it's possible to be a member of the EU and not use the euro. That might change in the future. I think it will. There's not been a new member into the bloc for 10 years. But as I said, I'm basing this on the ground where we are now. We know that countries can join and they can say we're moving towards that, but that journey can take 10, 15, 20, 25 years. So we know those things are all true. And that's where I want to say if all these things are true, then can we start having the conversation, a binary conversation, to say it's about the pound and it's about our currency. There's no third option. And I feel that this is really confusing the movement as a whole, but it's leaking out into the conversations that a lot of activists are having when people are still saying, what about the euro? And someone at this meeting last night said to me, well, I'd be in favour of the euro. And we just need to try and defog this whole situation by saying there's no plan. We could even be members without using it, but it's such a long time away. Let's look at just the decision to use sterling or create our own currency. And here's a little timeline for the euro. So yes vote 2030, 5 years, 2 years, apply for membership, EU member, and then within 3 years, we would have the euro. So we're talking about 20 years from now. And I think for me, that's kind of the final nail in the coffin of the discussion around if Scotland would use the euro any period close to independence. So there's 6 steps. There's become independent, use sterling for a while, use our own currency, get close to matching the economic conditions with the EU, and you can see on the slide there, I mean converging with the EU economy. There's joining the EU and then using the euro. Okay, so there's 6 steps to using the euro, and that's 20 years minimum. We really need to say, let's park this, let's park the euro, and let's focus on what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation, which is the direction of our journey to converge with the European Union and all the economic effect that have. Okay, so keep sterling or use the pound, and it's a binary choice. So the choice for Scotland's currency is a binary one, sterling or a Scottish pound. And if there's one thing that I would like people to take away from tonight, it would be that we stop having conversations about the euro and we start saying we keep using sterling for a longer period, or we introduce the currency quicker than is planned. That's the only 2 options. Okay, so that's the first part. I'm now going to talk about something which I think is a little bit more controversial. And this is, as I've got on this slide here, converging with the EU economy. So I've changed this slide again slightly. So you'll see that as soon as we vote yes in 2030, we have to start converging with the EU economy. Okay, so from 2030 all the way up to becoming a member, so that whole decade, we've got to move our economy much closer to the type or the average European economy. And I'm going to cover how you do that and what impact it has. But before I get there, I think the most important political or communications message I want to get across is that I find it really peculiar that we want to leave one union and join another one. And I know some people feel like that, and I know some people feel differently. I know the EU is much less constrictive than the UK, and in many ways it's not comparing apples with apples, but it just seems odd that our elected politicians in the SNP still sell our independence as part of the EU. And, you know, this is a rhetorical question, but I would be welcome to hear what some of you think. Is there belief that the promise of much more sovereignty is not appealing enough? Is leaving this anachronistic union not appealing enough? And if it isn't, I think this could be described as partly as a colonial mindset. And I think it's shared by some indie supporters that, you know, we believe that we can't manage or cope without a powerful partner helping us. And this really is the too wee, too poor, too stupid argument from within the independence movement. I think we should be leaving, or we should be selling leaving the UK as what we want. We're going to leave this UK because of the damage that it does us. We're going to stand on our own 2 feet, and then we'll decide if we want to cede more sovereignty. Now, ceding sovereignty is something that we're definitely going to have to do, you know, whether that's joining the EU or EFTA or being part of the United Nations or in NATO. But why discuss this now? Why do you think we need an end destination past leaving the UK? And I think that's a really, really important point for us all to consider. Why is this message being sold that our future has to be in another big union? It is peculiar. So this administration is 100% supportive of EU membership, and it's extended this past independence. It's independence in the EU. And this is a quote from just a couple of weeks ago. I believe that rejoining the EU should be our clearly stated goal and a national mission. So John Swinney said that earlier this month. And in response, I suppose, I want to make the case for staying outside the EU for at least a decade after independence. And my call for people within the movement, and especially within the Scottish Government, is once you've heard this presentation, tell me I'm wrong. Show me the evidence and demonstrate that I'm wrong, because it's not good enough to just stand up and say Brexit was bad and we didn't want Brexit, therefore being part of the EU is good. We need much more detail in that. And I think it's essential that we start discussing the details, because the story that I'm going to tell you is not a pretty one. And if this is the journey that we're taking, we need to be honest with the electorate. And if it's not, and if it can be argued differently, then that's got to be done. Because I think at the moment, there's too many people within the movement and within the Scottish Government and within the wider independence body who just think that we go back to the EU and everything will be fine. Okay, so I hope that's a decent enough position before we jump into all of the details. And thanks for the comments and questions so far. All right, so let's say we're all in agreement and we've got this national mission. Okay, so what does converging with the EU economy? And I suppose I'll just summarize here. When you become a member, a big part of that is to be able to enter into this block for trading arrangements. And we had to do that. You've got to make sure that your economy is starting to look similar like the rest of the European Union economies. And there's a whole list of criteria how you get there. But where Scotland is now and how we get there, there is a journey where we've got to converge with that economy. And I'm going to go into what the impacts of that are. So here's 5 things that we have to do if an independent Scotland wanted to converge with the EU economy. Okay, so the first one is that we'd have to keep our interest rates similar to the rates of the European Central Bank. which would mean effectively we were in a position where we weren't managing our interest rates. We were keeping them close, or as close as we possibly could, to the rates in the ECB. And they'll be very similar, if not identical, to the ECB during this conversion, this 15-year period. We're likely that we're going to have to run some form of semi-fixed currency peg with the euro, which mean our currency is either too high or too low to balance our economy. And this is likely to lead to inflation or unemployment, because we can't set or have that currency that's at the ideal economic conditions for an independent nation. We've got to keep inflation the same as the European average, and that may have the same effect. If we keep it too low, it's likely that unemployment will be higher than it needs to be. The next point is that we must start opening up to EU exports. I'm going to cover that in a lot of detail, and this will likely worsen our trade balance. And then finally, and this is the bit I'm going to go into even more detail, is we need to converge towards the Stability and Growth Pact fiscal rules of 60% debt to GDP and 3% deficit to GDP rules. So those are just five of the main things that you have to do if you've got to converge with the EU economy. And anyone who is going to be critical of some of the things that I'm going to say, you need to look at these 5 things and argue that we don't need to do that when we're trying to converge, because I'm very strongly suggesting that these are just 5 things that we must do to be able to converge. Okay, so any points, any questions on that? I think it will be great. And so let's move through there. Okay, so if we become members of the European Union, or moving towards members, and we've got to converge to the European Union, what does this do to those 6 things that I said are the strongest drivers for leaving, strongest economic drivers for leaving the UK? Well, the first thing is that our own currency. Yep, we do have our own currency. However, we don't have the ability to do lots of things that you do when you've got your own currency, because we're moving towards the European Union membership. When we're looking at a growth model, we definitely have a growth model in the sense that Scotland can start looking at its economy and say, okay, how do we develop our economy? We've got all the powers to do that. So that's a definite positive of EU membership from the UK. Now, the next thing is control more aspects of the economy. And again, we're definitely in a position to be able to do that, because we can set our own energy policy, immigration policies, and all these types of things that we know impact our economy and our society. We are able to change interest rates, but as I outlined earlier, it's unlikely that they would be set to a level that benefits the Scottish economy, because we've got to keep it as close to the ECB. And the ECB tends to set the interest rate that best suits the German economy, which couldn't be further from the Scottish economy if you tried. The next thing would be to escape the austerity paradigm. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that now and say, without a shadow of a doubt, the European Union is as much of a neoliberal, austerity-driven organisation as Westminster. So a huge issue with how we manage our economy and whether we're able to get to a well-being economy. And then the next thing is fiscal spending. So we are able to tax and spend, but because of these fiscal rules, we don't have the ability to change that to the extent that we would want to manage the Scottish economy. So my big question is that joining the EU gives us more control over other parts of economy, but it doesn't give us control of the economy. And is that all we aspire to when we become independent again? So we have all this potential when we become independent to do all of these things, set our own interest rates to a much greater extent, control inflation to an extent that's much more tailored to Scotland. Our fiscal spending can match taxation or not. It's completely down to us, and we're deciding not to do that because we're converging with the EU. So that's the convergent journey, and I would say, I think at the moment it's fair to say that we've got a movement that follows the lead of the Scottish Government, and it's very pro-EU. And I think the current administration is unable to explain the impact of converging with the EU. And I don't think there's any pro-European groups within the movement who've been able to do this so far either. So please, if you're a pro-EU member of the independence movement, start asking policymakers about that journey. If you're a member of a pro-Euro independence group, where's your evidence that this will be the best thing for the Scottish economy as we converge as a member of the European Union? And at the end of this presentation, I have a question that I'd like you to ask next time you're out of your group, next time you're in front of an MP or an MSP. And I'm going to go through this in a lot more detail, but these are the significant restrictions on our economy if we're converging to be members of the European Union. So I'm going to firstly kind of concentrate on the economic paradigm in the European Union. And as I said, we want to escape an austerity paradigm. And if we move to the EU's neoliberal austerity paradigm, you can see how similar it is to the UK. And I'll just give you a second to just kind of brush over that. But, you know, from the very beginning, the European Monetary Union, as it was back before 1997, it was a neoliberal project, and where governments would retreat from any and every area of the economy to give space for private action. The European Central Bank was central to this project and was a cheerleader for structural reforms, privatisation, all of these supply side changes to an economy. And if we want to create a well-being economy, I think we've got to pursue a well-being paradigm, and that is not possible within the European Union because it operates in this paradigm. And again, if you're supportive of the European Union, tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where I've got it wrong and that these things don't lead the decisions in the European Union when it comes to policy. Just tell me where I'm wrong and we'll discuss it in detail, or I'll change this paradigm. But that's where we are now. Now, I want to just briefly bring up what a well-being paradigm looks like. Okay, so here we have the neoliberal austerity paradigm and all the things that lead to neoliberal market-based policies. And here we have a well-being paradigm. And this is the type of policies that support the ethical standards, the methodologies that you need to create well-being policies. And they are completely alien to this policy paradigm that we would inherit as a member of the European Union. I'm not fully finished outlining what this paradigm looks like, but I think it's enough for people to see that if we want to create a well-being economy, we have to have a paradigm that supports it. And I believe that belonging to either the UK or the EU is incompatible with Scotland's well-being economy. And that's based on this paradigm, this austerity paradigm, and then a well-being paradigm. So I think we could control a huge amount, but we've given up so much control if we move towards the EU. So joining the EU gives us more control, but not control of our economy. And isn't that the point of independence? So that's my overview of what happens if we move towards the EU. Now, all of this is before we've even become a member. And I need to stress, this affects Scotland on day one of independence. Now, institutions, formal like our central bank, or more informal like our labour market, take time to develop. Okay, that these markets are path dependent. Okay, and where we've come from and where we're ending up affects where we are now. And even now, before we become independent, we're focusing our institutions on EU membership. Once independence, this is completely powered up. The Scottish Government has stated that it wants to start the conversion process in day one of independence by following the EU's fiscal rules. So all of our institutions start to develop with the destination in mind. And this means it becomes much harder to change those institutions as time passes. The decisions made by the administration that take us to independence really matter. We cannot just say, well, we'll vote differently once we're independent. The first half a decade is crucial when we're setting up these institutions, and we lose all of our flexibility and all of our resilience if the predetermined destination is to match EU accession criteria. Now, I think we must create institutions that work best for us as an independent nation. That should be the target. From there, we can mould them to match any criteria we feel that we need to match whether that be the EU or some other formal bloc of nations. But the most important point is that on independence, we look at all of our institutions and we think, how can we design these to support a well-being economy? Because that's what we've all voted for, and that's the type of independence that I believe that the vast majority of Scottish independence supporters want. That's what we should focus on, not where we end up in terms of a trading arrangement or another bloc of nations. We've got to concentrate on what we want to happen in those first 10 years of independence, and that has got to be to set up institutions that make the most of that opportunity to be as monetary sovereign as possible. Okay, now I'm going to start looking at a little bit of detail, and thanks so much for all of the comments so far. I'm doing okay for time. I think I'll only be about another 10 minutes. So to demonstrate these impacts, I'm going to summarize the institution of fiscal rules. Okay, so you'll see on this slide here, here's the 5 things, and that means the result is that we operate with the austerity paradigm and we're unable to achieve a well-being economy. So I'm going to look at this institution of fiscal rules, which is just number 5. So I'm only making the argument that independence in the EU is a bad idea using the evidence from this one element aligning with the Stability and Growth Pact. I'd be able to make the similar argument for EU exports, for inflation, for fixing the currency, for setting our interest rates, but I'm just concentrating on this one to give you a really clear idea of the impact it can have. So the debt and deficit rules are known as the Stability and Growth Pact. And this is going to be detailed in our paper that's coming up in March. It's about a 20-page paper looking specifically at the economic impact of adopting the European Union Stability and Growth Pact in an independent in Scotland. And the current Scottish Government has said that we will adopt these rules on day 1 of independence. And again, only looking at the current information that's available, that's where we start. But for any administration who wants Scotland to be part of the European Union within 10, 15 years, would have to start aligning with the Stability and Growth Pact at some point. This administration has just decided to do it a lot earlier than most people, even if you were supportive of EU, would suggest. So huge issues with that timeline. But I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time in this because in the paper, we dig into this really, really deeply. Well, actually, it's important to say as part of the paper, we've created a model that anyone can download and use. So you can, for example, see what level of exports we'd need to achieve to beat these rules, or what level of GDP growth. So it's completely interactive. You can decide if you think it's possible that Scotland's going to increase its exports by 50%, and maybe we'll avoid some of the problems, but you can play about with it, and I would really encourage everyone to do that. So the Stability and Growth Pact is 60% debt to GDP and 3% deficit to GDP. So we're just focusing on the idea that each year the government can have no more than a 3% deficit. Okay, so it's got to have no more than, it's got to spend no more than 3% of GDP more than it collects in taxes. This is very similar to the fiscal rules that the UK currently has at the moment. And I'm sure you can all see the huge issues that this is causing in every section of our government having to fit to these rules. This is exactly where we would be as members or moving towards the EU. Okay, now I'm going to take the sectorial balances approach to show you what this all means. And I'm just going to make sure I'm not going to rush this because it can be quite complicated. So the first thing I'm going to look at is what sectorial balances are. And so I've got our draft sectorial balances for Scotland, and these are drafts. Some of the figures need to be changed. But if you look at what's on the screen here, very simply, it says that there's 3 parts of our economy. There's external, there's the public sector, and then there's the private sector, which is basically the non-government sector, which is me or you. And all of that, all of the financial wealth has to sum to 0. If someone has a debt, someone else has a credit. If someone has a credit, someone else has a debt, and it has to sum to 0. And that's the line that you see right along the middle there. So 2023 is a really good example. In 2023, you can see that the external sector had an 11% surplus. So we were importing 11% less than we were exporting. So within our economy, there was 11% of our money leaving the economy. So to get that to zero, that money had to come from the other two sectors. It had to come from the private sector, or it had to come from the public sector. And as you can see in 2023, that 11% all came from the government spending more than it collected in tax. So the Scottish government was attributed an 11% deficit. So that was Scotland's spending and also UK spending on Scotland on behalf of. That's how the economy balanced. You'll see the year before, similar trade deficit of around about 10, 11%. That year, government spending was a little bit less. So the government spent around about 7 or 8%, and the other 3% came out from the private sector. And it's the blue bit that's the most interesting part, because that means that year in 2022, and you can kind of know why, because that was the year after COVID when so much money had been pumped in by the government. But in 2022, the private sector in Scotland saved less or started drawing down its savings. So at the end of the year, we had less savings than we did at the start of the year. So this is a crucial position, and you'll see right up into the financial crisis, when the private sector is in deficit, we're very quickly pulling down our savings, and we start to get into financial distress at this point. And you can see in 2008, this is where the financial distress landed. So it's really important, as we're talking through things, that you realize that what you've got to do amongst everything is keep your private sector in surplus. Make sure it's not drawing down its debt. And that's the fundamental position that I'd like you to take away. So that's the sectorial balance approach. Now, the rules that we've signed up to say that the government deficit cannot be larger than 3%. Okay. So the Sustainability and Growth Pact says if Scotland wants to move towards membership of the EU, it has to move towards a balance, a budget deficit no more than 3% of GDP. So let's look at how we've done for the last 25 years. So you'll see the black line here is the 3% deficit limit. Okay, so you'll see how often the public sector has met that target. It's not met it since 2022. The government expenditure by Scotland and the UK government has always been significantly higher than the 3% deficit, and it averages out round about 10%. Okay, so we're starting from a position that makes this 3% limit look pretty challenging, because there's no evidence that this has ever been done before. And remember, this is while we've been part of the we've been part of the United Kingdom. So how do we turn that round? How do we make sure that we can reach these targets? So taking the sectorial balances approach, and let's say, as we said, the foreign sector, for example, shows a 4% surplus, okay, meaning they export to us more than we import for them at 4%. Then the non-government sector has to make up the balance. So in this example, the non-government sector would have to contract by 1%, because all the three sectors are going to have to sum to zero. So if we keep this 3% rule, it directly impacts you and me. We are the non-government sector. And we show that by keeping to these limits, this will stunt Scotland's recovery from decades of underinvestment as part of the United Kingdom. When Scotland becomes independent, a new government will likely hear calls from every sector and every part of the economy for help. Independence will be the time to deliver Scotland's core economic mission of a just transition to a wellbeing economy, and to come to terms with climate and the biodiversity crisis. And to deal with this, and to deal with these multiple issues, will require an increase of government spending. But remember, the limit's 3% of GDP. So using the only available tool that we've got, which is GERS, Scotland's current deficit is 10%. So a new Scottish government would likely need to spend a higher percentage of GDP, higher than the 10% just to remain where we are, never mind catching up with our European neighbours. So with such a gap between its current budget deficit of 10% and the limit of 3%, and this is a really important point, if Scotland were to converge with the EU and adhere to the Stability and Growth Pact, it would almost certainly lead to an extensive austerity programme. And this is all before we even became members. Now, one of the huge benefits of using the sectorial balances is that it's an accounting identity. It's not an economic opinion. It shows you where the money has to come from or where it ends up. So there's a huge amount of depth when you look at models that are based on the sectorial balance, which is what we've done. Now, our paper explores this in detail, and I'm not going to go all the detail because Dirk's done all the work for us. And I've got to say thanks to all of our past attendees and all the people who support us on Patreon, because we've been able to pay Dirk, and he's a European expert on this. And needless to say, no one from the Scottish Government has ever approached Dirk to model this. And I don't think the Scottish Government have approached anyone to actually look into the detail of what the Stability and Growth Pact rules would do to Scotland. And it's unfortunate, but we've had to do that. Now, if you assume that being an EU member has benefits, then in this position, we're taking all of the pain before we're getting any of the benefits of the European Union. And that you need to ask yourself if that is a price worth paying. So this is just the kind of scenario to say that this is the position that we're in. And I noticed someone talking about GERS there. And as I said, if you missed my presentation at the start, we've got to base it on the best assumptions that we have, and GERS is a reasonably good assumption. And maybe you don't think it's particularly good, but if you take away the amount of public deficit, then that spending has to come from somewhere, which leads to it coming from the private sector. So it's a really good position to start using GERS, because we get a decent idea of what changes we would have to make, and you can do that using the model. But we all know GERS is not fantastic, but it's all that we've got, and it's really useful for this model. Okay, so to summarise, convergence will ensure that we create institutions best suited to being members of the EU, not ones best suited to what Scotland needs immediately after independence. Now, there'll inevitably be significant differences between those two outcomes. Converging will ultimately lead to massive austerity in Scotland, perhaps for 2 decades, and would ensure we continue within a neoliberal austerity economic paradigm. Now, I think it will make it impossible to achieve a well-being economy. And I think the current approach, and this is a really important point, this is not saying in any way that independence cannot work or will not work. This is saying that the current approach will not deliver the type of independence that I believe the vast majority of indie supporters want to achieve. And I think, considering this will be mainly a pro-independence audience, I think it's exceptionally important for you to understand that. This is not saying independence is bad. This is saying the current approach, as envisioned by the current administration, will lead to this, not that there's any problem with independence. So finally, I'm going to briefly look at, and I'm already seeing it in the comments, I'm going to head off 3 answers to this that I heard a little bit last night and I hear in general. So if I'm saying that because of this deficit and the deficit that's being run by the government having to reduce, and how much that's going to have to be paid by the private sector, and that private sector payment can only come in the forms of austerity. One way to say that that won't happen is that the economy will grow. So public debt is calculated in relation to GDP. So if all things stay the same and the economy grows, then the public debt figure comes down. Okay, we all agree that if the pie's getting bigger and it's the same percentage, then the actual amount's smaller. But the average economic growth rate for Scotland for the last 20 years is 1.4%. Okay, so I think it's fair to expect that going forward, 1% growth would be a possible scenario for 2025 to 2030. And that rate of GDP is actually one of the ones that we've modelled in the paper. And that shows that it has little impact on public debt. So a 1% up to 1.4%, we actually model 1.4% as well in the paper, shows you that it has a very minimal impact on what the level of austerity would be. So that's the first point. The second point, which I think is really, really interesting here, is that you can see that the Scottish economy grows basically, or shrinks basically, when the UK economy grows. And that's really strong evidence. And there's a whole different conversation about having our government running around saying it can grow the economy when all the evidence suggests that it absolutely cannot. It really depends what's happening in the EU. But I want to take this argument forward and say that if we argue this is the case for the UK and we're moving towards the EU, it's a fair assumption to say that our economy is only going to grow if the EU economy grows. Now, the EU economy this year is expected to grow at less than 1%, so less than the UK economy. So I'm just saying there's no way that we can grow the economy out of this problem, or no evidence that that's possible. But it seems to be the answer to any question or problem. It'll be fine because the economy will grow. And that's not good enough. There's no detail or evidence to support the idea that we would be able to double GDP growth. And I think in the paper, we're looking at something like 3 or 4% growth to be able to move away from the impact of austerity. And a really crucial point is that government spending has to fall if you're trying to get to the SGP limit of 3%, but government spending is a significant driver of GDP. So expecting that you're going to greatly increase GDP while at the same time reducing one of the significant drivers of GDP is just really economically illiterate. And that is the position that we're in. And it's really, really, really worrying. So the second point, and it's good to have Keith on here because we had this conversation a little bit on Twitter a couple of days ago. We talk about access to the single market being the thing that's going to save us all. Okay, so one of the most common things that I hear is that it's fine because we'll be in the EU and that's access to seamless access to the world's largest single market by value. And that is, of course, true. That is absolutely what it'll be. But I think it's important to highlight some of the other important factors here. There's 27 countries in Europe and only 9 of them run a surplus. That's in between intra-trade between the EU. Only 9 have a surplus. Okay, so there's 18 countries currently in the EU who have a trade deficit. Now, at the moment, Scotland's got a small trade deficit with the EU. And Scotland exports 80 billion worth of goods and services annually. Okay, and in 2021, only 15 billion of this went to the EU. But around 50% of that was from oil and gas exports. In fact, in 2023, approximately 25% of Scotland's entire exports outside the UK were in oil and gas. Okay, so if we are talking about moving from a trade deficit, being in Europe, to a trade surplus, I'm saying, well, all these other countries haven't managed it. We're going to lose our biggest export in a decade. Our biggest export to Europe, it possibly in 10 years is either going to not exist or be it's really, really small in terms of the overall amount. So we're going to enter the EU with a significant trade deficit within the European Union. 50 billion of our exports go to our UK, 15 billion to EU, and 15 billion to the rest of the world. So trade to the EU, as we all know, has fallen, but it's actually fallen about 6% after Brexit. But all this has meant is that we've become more reliant on trade with the UK. And as soon as we enter into converging with the European Union, we're going to start at a much lower rate than we would have 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So you can see Scotland's trade balance here, and you can see how it's worsening over that period of time. Our exports are going up, but not by as much as our imports. And as I said, showing you the sectorial balances, this has a big effect on where that money has to come from. And to balance that, to turn that economy round so that everything sums up to zero, if we're giving all that money away, it has to come from either the public sector or the private sector. And if the government's running a 3% deficit, then that comes from us, and that is austerity. So the idea that we're going to turn this round by simply entering this union, I can't see any evidence that better access to the single market will reduce our trade deficit. And that's the important thing. You can speak about everything else around the European Union, even some of the economic factors. There's no evidence that will reduce our trade deficit, which has a big impact on GDP and a big impact on the public and the private sector balances. It'll increase our exports, but it will also increase our imports. Remember, all of those 27 nations have access to our markets too. And I think we seem to forget about imports when we talk about the EU single market. Now, I'm not saying that access to the single market is unimportant. Maybe we can reduce the trade balance, and I'd like to see an evidence-based argument made for that, but it would have to be a huge turnaround to prevent the government from funding a deficit larger than 3%. And if you want to see what export figures, you can play with our model and have a look. But that's the reality of it at the moment. And you can see how much of our exports, almost 80 billion, goes to the rest of the UK and the other sectors. So we're starting from a difficult position, being a deficit nation with the EU. Now, the final thing I hear is people telling me that we just need to be like Ireland. Now, I know a lot of people will have made that argument or heard that argument, and it would take a whole presentation for me to get into the details of why Ireland's so different. But a few things I would like to say is that I can make some general points. Every nation is very different. Okay, so looking at Ireland and just assuming that it would work from Scotland is just not feasible. It's not how you would do any type of analysis. For every EU nation, like Ireland, there's a Greece. Ireland's been a member of the EU for 50 years. It entered as one of the poorest countries. It was absolutely hollowed out for a decade after the financial crisis. It's got a unique growth model that no one else in Europe can or would even want to replicate, I believe. There's a lot of problems in the Irish economy and society. Ireland's GDP is expected to have declined by 0.5% last year, and this was due to the contraction in the multinational sector, which is a huge part and a huge risk for their economy, especially with what's happening in America. Ireland is not a template for Scotland. And if we're going to make that argument, we have to make it in a much more detailed, meaningful, relevant way. So I'm getting there now. In closing, aligning Scotland's economic and institutional framework to meet EU membership criteria would come at the expense of addressing the country's most pressing needs in the early years of independence. The consequences of this approach would be profound, leading to a prolonged period of austerity, potentially lasting decades, and reinforcing a neoliberal economic model that is incompatible with the principles of a well-being economy. Pursuing this path would ultimately fall short of delivering the kind of independence that many supporters envision for Scotland. And this is a question that I've got for you and for you to ask your pro-EU groups and MPs and MSPs. What happens in the period after winning independence and becoming a member of the EU? What does convergence look like for Scotland's economy and society? Because we've answered that question in this paper, and I really feel that it's over to the Scottish Government and to the wider movement to do the same, because we can't just assume that being members of the European Union is the best thing for Scotland's economy or society. And I think we're long past the position where we can just say Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. Okay.